This week, the United States turns 250 years old, half the world's software, a third of its Nobel Prizes, the first footprints on the moon from a country younger than some London pubs. But the same story includes stolen land, human beings sold at auction, and a war that killed more Americans than every foreign enemy combined. 250 years. The good, the bad, and the genuinely great, this is the entire history of the United States in 15 minutes, starting long before it was the United States at all. Because the land was never empty. People had been here for at least 15,000 years. By the year 1100, while London held maybe 15,000 people, a city called Cahokia stood on the Mississippi River, with plazas, pyramids of earth, and as many residents as London. Tens of millions of people lived across the continent, in hundreds of nations speaking hundreds of languages. Then, in 1492, ships appeared on the horizon. What followed wasn't mostly conquest by sword, it was disease. Smallpox and measles ran ahead of the explorers and killed up to 90% of the native population. The greatest demographic catastrophe in human history had already happened before the first English colonists stepped ashore. 1607, 104 Englishmen land in Virginia and build a fort called Jamestown, a business venture funded by investors who wanted gold. There was no gold. Within 3 years, 80% of them were dead. Starvation so severe, the survivors dug up graves. What saved the colony wasn't gold at all. It was a plant the Powhatan people knew well, tobacco. And in 1619, two things arrived in Virginia within weeks of each other. The first elected assembly in the Americas and the first ship carrying enslaved Africans. Democracy and slavery landed together. That contradiction would define the next 4 centuries. The colonies grew fast, 13 of them by the 1730s, each different. Puritans in New England building towns around churches and schools, Quakers in Pennsylvania preaching tolerance, planters in the South building fortunes on tobacco, rice, and on the backs of 500,000 enslaved people. By 1775, 2.5 million colonists lived here, and they were among the richest, freest people on Earth, which is exactly why a few new taxes felt unbearable. Britain, broke after a world war with France, wanted the colonies to pay their share. The colonists' answer: no taxation without representation. Tea went into Boston Harbor, redcoats marched to Lexington, and on an April morning in 1775, somebody fired a shot nobody ever took credit for. July 4th, 1776, 56 men sign a document declaring that all men are created equal, written by a man who owned 600 human beings. The contradiction is the point. America was born as a promise it hadn't kept yet. On paper, the war was absurd. The British Empire was the superpower of the planet. Washington's army was farmers who kept deserting to bring in the harvest. He lost more battles than he won, but he understood one thing: he didn't have to win. He just had to not lose until Britain got tired. Then, at Saratoga, the Americans crushed a British army, and France, itching for revenge, joined the war. In 1781, trapped between Washington's army and the French fleet at Yorktown, the British surrendered. The superpower had lost to its own colonies. Then came the plot twist nobody expected. The winners almost blew it. The first American government was so weak it couldn't collect taxes or stop states from printing funny money. So, in 1787, 55 delegates locked themselves in a Philadelphia room through a brutal summer and invented a machine of government. 3 branches, checks and balances, a constitution, the oldest one still running anywhere in the world. And then George Washington did the most radical thing any victorious general has ever done. He had the power. Kings ruled everywhere on earth. And after 2 terms, he walked away. When told Washington would give up power, King George III reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." 1803, Napoleon, desperate for cash, offers to sell France's entire territory in North America for $15 million, about 3 cents an acre. Jefferson doubles the size of the country overnight. Lewis and Clark walk to the Pacific and back, and a word starts appearing in American newspapers: destiny. The idea that the continent was meant to be American. It powered wagons west, and it steamrolled everyone in the way. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act ordered entire nations off their land. On the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee were marched 1,000 miles in winter. 4,000 died. A war with Mexico took the entire Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico. By 1848, the map ran ocean to ocean, and gold had just been found in California. The rush was on. But every mile west sharpened one question: would the new lands be free or slave? By 1860, 4 million people were enslaved in the South. Cotton picked by their hands was America's biggest export, the oil of its day. The South's entire economy and its politics were built on keeping it that way. Then Abraham Lincoln, a man who said only that slavery must not spread, won the presidency without a single Southern state. Within weeks, Southern states began leaving the Union. They said why in writing, plainly, to preserve slavery. In April 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter. Americans would now find out what it cost to fight themselves. 4 years. Gettysburg, 50,000 casualties in 3 days. Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. New weapons, old tactics, rifles that killed at half a kilometer, generals still marching men shoulder to shoulder across open fields. In 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation turned the war into something bigger than Union. It became a war to end slavery. 200,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army to finish that job. By the spring of 1865, it was over. The Confederacy in ashes, slavery abolished by constitutional amendment, and Lincoln, 6 days after the surrender, shot dead in a theater. 750,000 Americans died, more than both world wars combined. For a decade after the war, something remarkable happened. Black men voted, won elections, served in Congress. Then the troops went home, and the backlash arrived. Jim Crow laws, segregation, terror. The promise was shelved for a century. Meanwhile, the country turned its energy to iron and steam. Railroads stitched the coast together, built largely by Chinese and Irish immigrant labor. Rockefeller's oil, Carnegie's steel, Edison's electric light, the telephone. They called it the Gilded Age. Gold on top, iron underneath, 12-hour shifts, child labor, strikes broken by force, and through the gates of Ellis Island came 12 million immigrants, Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, betting everything on the American promise. By 1900, the United States outproduced every nation on Earth, and most of the world hadn't noticed yet. The world noticed in 1917. America entered the First World War late, tipped the balance, and came home convinced it never wanted to do that again. The 20s roared, jazz, radio, cars for everyone, women voting at last, the stock market a national casino. Then, October 1929, the casino collapsed. Banks failed by the thousands. A quarter of the country unemployed. Farms literally blew away in walls of dust. Franklin Roosevelt answered with the New Deal. Social security, jobs programs, rules for banks, the idea that a government owes its citizens a floor to stand on. It softened the Depression. It didn't end it. What ended it was the worst thing that ever happened. December 7th, 1941. Japanese planes destroy the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor before breakfast. 2,400 Americans dead, and the ocean between America and the world disappears for good. What happened next has no parallel. American factories built 300,000 aircraft, more than all its enemies combined. Rosie the Riveter became the face of millions of women who built them. GIs stormed Omaha Beach on D-Day and island after island in the Pacific. And in the New Mexico desert, refugee scientists, many fleeing Hitler, built the atomic bomb. In August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war and opened a moral question that has never closed. America emerged with half the world's industrial output and a new rival with its own bomb. The Cold War. 45 years of staring contest with the Soviet Union, fought everywhere except head-on. Korea, the McCarthy witch hunts at home, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days in October 1962, when two men genuinely held the end of the world in their hands, and a naval blockade and a back-channel deal pulled it back. Vietnam, 58,000 American names on a black granite wall, and a generation that stopped trusting its government. And then, the Soviets put a satellite overhead, and America decided to answer on the biggest stage possible, the moon. July 20th, 1969. 400,000 engineers, computers weaker than a calculator watch, and Neil Armstrong steps onto another world. 600 million people watched, the largest audience in human history to that moment. And while rockets climbed, the oldest promise finally came due at home. Rosa Parks kept her seat on a Montgomery bus. 9 children walked through screaming mobs to enter a school in Little Rock. Martin Luther King stood at the Lincoln Memorial and told 250,000 people about a dream, the Declaration's own words, read back to the country like an unpaid invoice. It worked, at terrible cost. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65, King murdered in Memphis in 68. A century after emancipation, the law finally said what the Declaration had said all along. The promise still wasn't fully kept, but it was closer than it had ever been. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and for a moment, America stood completely alone at the top, the only superpower in history with no rival in sight. In a California valley full of orchards, engineers had spent decades building something smaller than a fingernail, the microchip, personal computers. Then, a network of networks escaped the laboratory. The internet, born as a Pentagon project, became the new frontier. Google in a garage, the iPhone in a keynote. American software ate the world's daily life. Then, one September morning in 2001, 2 towers fell in Manhattan, 3,000 people died, and the country spent 20 years and $8 trillion in wars that ended in the same airport chaos where they began. Greatness and blunder still traveling together. So, 250 years. A country that enslaved millions and then bled itself half to death to stop. That broke every treaty it signed with the people who were here first, and later wrote their heroism into its monuments. that turned away refugee ships in one decade and rebuilt its defeated enemies into allies in the next, the Marshall Plan, the most successful act of generosity in political history. That put a man on the moon, cured polio, invented jazz, the blues, hip-hop, Hollywood, and the internet. The pattern, over and over, a promise made, a promise broken, and someone, an abolitionist, a suffragette, a preacher from Atlanta standing up to demand the country read its own founding document out loud. All men are created equal. America has spent 250 years arguing with itself about what those words mean. The argument is the country, and it's not finished. Happy 250th America. If this story taught you something, the next one goes deeper. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.